So thank you guys for showing up to Beyond Borders. It's the first in our series to really help talk about the change in the way that hybrid working is created and starting to work forward, and changing the way that we're actually interacting with our desktops and PCs. So today we're going to be talking, and I've got to thank a lot of our Lenovo, Oracle, IGEL people for coming in and supporting us in this particular endeavor. I really appreciate that. As you look at our agenda today, we're really going to talk about we're going to talk a little bit about the hybrid work revolution, and we're going to have Pavla. Then we'll be having Jed come up talking about Innovate, Collaborate, and Succeed. And we'll be having Harvey come up and talking about empowering his teams and bringing things together in the hybrid workforce. And then off to the game to try to head out and have a good time there. So the easy part to really start off with is really kind of level set the room and figure out what is actually being used today. A lot of times when we look at the virtual desktop or the return to work type scenario, what do you guys usually look at today? Is it usually embrace? Is it usually I'm not doing this, or is it usually disregard or block? Which level are you into in the remote working today? And that's usually the question that you go with. Try to figure out where the person's at. Is it high security, pressure, compliance, configuration, those types of things that they're looking for to get involved in. Because as you start looking at hybrid work, you start getting into what we call the questions of your existing legacy environments, the question of the stuff that you're having to really put out there today. We start looking at what we call the IKEA effect. I think the IKEA effect is this really great way to kind of summarize where your existing applications and your existing desktops and so forth are at today. And where that is looking at it from the perspective that the IKEA effect was a project that they did where they actually brought in 10 different IKEA people who bought IKEA furniture, did a survey after they did the furniture and building it and said, how much would you pay for this item, or how much would you sell this item for after you built it? And of course, they all say that they would spend more, or they would actually charge you more for the actual item that they built. Even though you know as well as I do, you don't really have all the parts and pieces when you put an IKEA thing together, right? Unfortunately, that's usually my situation that I deal with all the time. And so you got to imagine that they're willing to charge you more for something that they know is currently inferior or currently has a part or piece or missing. And it's because they're invested in the actual design or build of that cabinet. You can buy a brand new one, but you're invested in the one you just built already, right? And that's really key, because as you're starting to look at that change, the stuff that you need to change in the environment, having the right questions or understanding where you want to go, and that the current situations don't solve the current problems, right? As you start looking forward, and we started looking at the applications and the sets, it started being my own reality in which I started looking at how much of the actual browser I was using inside of my actual daily work environment. Because as time has progressed, and I'll kind of build these out, it has been millions and billions of people who are leveraging billions of users with millions of apps who are in the plethora of everything from big data, ML, AI, cloud, different areas that are a part of it, but primarily they all use the browser to get access to most of these application sets. And it's actually further increasing as it goes along, because the browser itself is one of the biggest applications to actually use. And what I find often is when I was at just recently at the Gartner Digital Workplace Strategy, is that a lot of the individuals who are coming to actually have conversations there were primarily there to figure out what was working, what wasn't working, and so forth. And they had all these different paths that they could take with the legacy. But I found one thing that I think was the defining factor that really used to have to start with when you think about hybrid working, and that is the browser, right? That's the answer that you start looking at. How do I create this browser strategy to really drive that overall conversation? Because as you look at it, I think we're having a great piece of the percentage of applications that are typically used today. As you start getting closer to the time that we're in, you'll see more and more applications are primarily browser-based applications. And most services are continuing to become more and more browser-based in general. And this is an important characteristic because most of the actual threats evolve because of the actual browser. They're coming in through the plugins, they're coming in through different areas today, whether you're doing phishing, whether you're getting the web threats that are coming in through browser plugins. I mean, how many chat GPT plugins have you guys looked at? Right? As you start looking at these particular plugins that are coming in, they're stealing data, moving things back and forth. And unfortunately, that's what a plugin does. So you can't stop it from doing the work that it's trying to actually get accomplished without it hampering the actual capability of these plugins or these capabilities. Right? So how do I start really understanding that if 80% of my work I'm using in the browser and 90% of the threats that are coming through the browser, then again, it's clear where I actually need to start looking at when I want to support this hybrid working area or this hybrid working work. So unfortunately, the existing systems and solutions fail to leverage a lot of the new technology as well. Right? A lot of the technology that we're pushing out today, everybody, when they went home from a hybrid working perspective, they may have thought everybody must have the same computer, right? That usually never happens. Everybody always had the fastest, most important thing that they were going to use when they got home because they had 10 screens and all the monitors necessary. Yeah, that didn't happen either, right? So oftentimes you would find that you didn't have the actual stuff that you needed. And as you started looking at changing out hardware or ramping up the particular people to support that, those become other issues that were happening. So it becomes difficult to manage this ever-expanding enterprise the mammoth that's coming in play. And a lot of these traditional environments are, one, costly and complex. I think that oftentimes when people ask me about what I see out in the environments, it's usually about complexity or it's about cost. Because with the complexity that's usually in play, it's that I've had the systems in play, I've built these things, I've got the Palo Alto networks, I've got the 10 different VPN switches, I've got the firewalls that I've got people coming in and egressing and out for. I've got jump boxes that people are coming in for, or tomorrow I'm thinking about doing some VDI DAS, right? And these are all, as these types of things are created or starting to be leveraged in that nature, these are the ones that have basically failed us. Because they are currently vulnerabilities. They're the attack surface that people are able to come in and attack also from that perspective. And as you start looking at that enterprise browser strategy that I was just describing, that's one of the important things that you need to start looking at as you start building that enterprise strategy. You had your phase 0 emergence, in which we had a lot of browsers that came into play, or it's that first part of that strategy that came into play with the browser that says, hey, I will secure it. I will keep it redacted, and I will keep the information or where they go in that browser, I'll keep that secured. And then, of course, as he started going past those phases and into those areas as time progresses, as I said, more and more SaaS-based applications are coming in play, more cloud-based applications are coming in play. So more of the browser as a platform really starts to become the next stage or the next evolution, that next generation that you really need to be at. And that's really where we started really seeing Kasm as a movement and Workspaces for Oracle as a movement really started seeing as where we wanted to go. Because that phase 1 or phase 0 to phase 1 of the secure enterprise browser strategy actually left a lot of people with questions. And it actually started changing the amount of productivity, because when you have two browsers on the same box, you have that increased cognitive load. The complexity and confusion of where do I save that file to, how do I get access to that particular one, or that fragmented working environment, meaning that I got two different locations or two different browser sets that I'm actually working through. One of the worst parts is increased system resource consumption. A lot of the browsers that we were looking at from a browser that was implemented on the actual endpoint requires additional resources from that endpoint to redact things. Or I still need to secure it in some of those situations with CloudStrike and the other things that are at the endpoint, or the EDR, MRI systems I'm doing. But overall, I'm trading this risk, but I'm also have this huge loss of productivity and inefficiency. And I think that's more importantly, as I start looking at, as I'm driving it from a enterprise browser strategy, is I've got to also look at productivity. That user has to maintain that level of productivity and capability that you want. So of course, I point out that building a hybrid strategy starts with building an enterprise browser strategy. that's how you actually start really looking at building out this strategy, building out an enterprise browser strategy. Because if most of my workload is working within the actual browser itself, then of course putting the right security and controls around that browser help me really drive that overall capability. As you start looking at some of these overall benefits, one, you have containerized browsers that start working, but now you start looking at containerized application sets. Now you start looking at the ability to connect to Windows applications, really any Java development, data science enabled type endeavors that you start working with. And that's really what Workspaces for Oracle was designed to really give that worker, that hybrid workers, those capabilities to start immediately accessing that type of resource from any device that was in play, right? Being able to say yes to a lot of the engaged situations. But we also wanted to make sure we reduce the total cost of ownership. A lot of the problems that we saw when you started looking at implementing VDI and some of those is that it had a long tail, it had a large upfront cost or process that had to be in play. Now you have the idea that it is about operational costs, and how I can design or work with the operational costs is really important for the growth of my business. And that's where I'm really looking at trying to really change this. Because what Workspaces for Oracle does at the very beginning is it leverages it for remote browser isolation from the enterprise browser strategy. That's the first part of your strategy that is really important. As you start looking at the Beyond Borders series, we'll start talking about more of evolving this strategy in play. But the number one thing that you start really looking at is remote browser isolation. Understanding that taking that actual browser and that resource away from the endpoint and letting the endpoint itself be managed separately as a read-only device, or managed in a way that it can stop keystrokes and loggers, such as our friends from IGEL, actually help in producing that nature. When they log us in, we're all set and we're ready to go, all the way up to the point where my users who are logging in, they're getting a rendering of actually what's actually being done in the back-end container. And this is an important characteristic because the container versus virtual machine conversation comes up quite often, and just the easy piece to look at is that in a virtual machine, it's executing on the virtual machine and it's presenting it back out to the individual. So whatever's happening gets executed on that virtual machine. What happens inside of a container is that in a container, it gets executed in the container, but the rendering is actually what's sent out to the browser. It's rendering out to the browser what is actually happening. So if something happens to that container, it's destroyed, and a new one is brought up for the next time you're actually logging in and starting to work. Right? A VM has a long life. It has an existence that it stays within. So therefore, it has to be managed. It has to be pruned. It has to have all the particular, my friends from Liquidware go, Windows rot that's within it that actually has to work from that perspective. We've dealt with this and delivered it in an entirely new and separate way. So when you start looking at how you do it, some of the fundamentals that come into play start becoming really obvious once you understand a remote browser isolation and what it does. As it starts looking at not only am I virtualizing and sandboxing and hardening the browser itself, so whether it's an IE, an Edge, a Tora, whichever browser you're looking for, we can harden and secure that browser inside and then deliver that particular browser out so that you're actually being able to do all the things that you're wanting to do, whether it be accessing malicious content that you may or may not want to, or if it's the idea that you're actually being able to control what type of access that you actually are getting. Because as you start filtering inside the container and filtering from that perspective, those are some of the capabilities you have. The other really important thing is that it is producing a zero-day conversation. And not often do you have that conversation with a lot of the products that are played. Because what happens is I'll talk to people and they'll say, yeah, I've got, CloudStrike, or I've got Defender, and I got the other things. And it's like, 7 different applications that you're putting on one thing to really stop what you're trying to do from a 0 day. And guess what? It still doesn't stop it. Tomorrow, somebody can come up with a brand new thing. They actually just came up with an RDP clip capability, which actually is a follow me home situation in which you connect from your desktop. If you have client drive mappings enabled to an RDP environment, it will actually send a file back to the endpoint, and now it's compromised your endpoint. Right? It's those type of techniques that they've been able to start creating and doing. They do this constantly. Inside of a 0 day situation in our capability, it's a actual container. So the container is destroyed as soon as it's actually brought up. And it's brought up, you're able to work within it, but it's destroyed after you're actually done with the session. So a lot of that actually comes from that perspective. As you start looking a little bit further in, there are a lot of different capabilities that we provide when you start looking at it from a browser-based strategy specifically. But again, as you start looking at your first steps to getting to that hybrid strategy, it's all about coming up with an enterprise browser strategy. It's no longer about just do I need an EUC or do I need VPN, jump boxes, or third-party movements. It's how do I bring in an enterprise browser strategy that can actually support all of those particular endeavors at once. Because it's the culmination of these particular things that start working for you all together. You have your browser and workspace containerization that you start with, and it starts containerizing those particular browsers in. But then you start really looking at, well, if the browser is key, and that's my 70 to 50 to 80% type that I'm using, then what's that other app that I might be using? And typically I usually go, well, what about Slack? And I go, yeah, I use Slack. That's the next one. Well, those are containerized. And we containerize that type of application. And it's really important because the amount of data and data leaking that can happen between the Slack application and movements, it's really important to look at how I would implement those applications as well in a containerized way, where we actually support rolling updates, customization of those apps. As you get a security patch update, it's constantly being updated and patched for you. When you start looking at the last one, it's about resource initiatives, about being able to get access to some of the best resources, such as ARM processors, new GPU processors, new capabilities that will allow you to utilize the different hardware in different ways. So with that, I will leave you with a couple of key things from my portion of the presentation. It is about saying yes to the business. That's really what you want to do from the enterprise browser strategy perspective, is being able to go to the business, say, yes, I can do yes to security and compliance. I can do yes to work from anywhere. I can say yes to working on any device, any browser. I can actually say yes to new business relationships or new edge services that I'm trying to push out. Or, you fill in the blank on what you're looking for from wanting to be able to say yes to the business with this type of strategy that you're putting in play. Okay? Now, with that, thank you for listening to my little banter and movement. I'm going to bring in another person who has actually did a lot of research around some of these particular technologies, but more importantly, that human aspect, right? I talk a lot about the technology and what it can use, but then you also got to figure out how they actually apply it and what they actually use it for that. So with that, I'm going to bring up Pavla.